today's mindful moment.
We always hear about how society is changing and evolving, but is it actually getting better? Is all this change really progress? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's a question a lot of people are grappling with these days.
It definitely seems like something worth exploring.
It is, and thankfully we've got a great guide for this kind of exploration.
Oh, yeah. Who's that?
George Will and his book, The Conservative Sensibility.
Oh, yeah. The Conservative Sensibility. That's a good one.
It really is. He dives deep into American political thought history, the whole shebang, and he really gets into what this conservative sensibility is all about.
That sounds right up our alley.
It is. It's all about trying to understand how these core principles get applied in the real world and why those foundational ideas of America, they still matter so much today.
I think for our listeners, this could be really valuable. They could walk away with a framework for thinking critically about all these claims of progress.
Exactly. We're constantly bombarded with these grand narratives about how everything's moving forward. But Will gives us the tools to really dissect those claims and see them from different perspectives.
So maybe we can start with this idea of a conservative sensibility. What exactly does Will mean by that?
Well, he describes it as this kind of interwoven relationship between political philosophy and a deeper way of experiencing events and time.
So it's not just like a fleeting attitude or something.
Right. It's more fundamental than that. It's an inclination, a way of seeing the world.
But it's not like a rigid set of rules.
No, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution for every single problem. Yeah. It's more like a continuous response.
It's adapting to circumstances.
Exactly. It's a living tradition, you could say, that needs careful statesmanship and that requires a real understanding of those principles, how to apply them to these complex situations.
He starts off by referencing Charles de Gaulle, that line about how hard it is to govern a country with 246 kinds of cheese.
Oh, yeah, I love that one.
It's so true, though. Even for a country with less cheese, it's still tricky. And that's because our feelings about our country, they run so deep, right?
Yeah, they're often tied to these big ideals that we might not even realize.
So what's the connection to what Will is trying to do with this book?
I think he's getting at this idea that how we feel about America, often without even knowing it, is connected to the principles it was founded on.
So it's all tied together.
Exactly. And his book is his own attempt to explain how he thinks about America, why he thinks this way of thinking is so important.
He thinks it's the best path to a flourishing nation and happy individual.
Right. It's both about the individual and the country as a whole.
Then he moves on to Lincoln and how he understood justice. He brings up the debate between Thrasymachus and Socrates.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic one. The idea that justice is just the interests of the stronger.
So how does Lincoln's view fit into all of this?
Well, if you follow Thrasymachus' argument, then justifying slavery based on the power of slave owners, it almost starts to make sense. Or even Douglas's popular sovereignty idea. Just letting people vote on whether to allow slavery.
Just reducing justice to a head count?
Exactly. But Will points out that Lincoln had a much deeper understanding.
He saw something more fundamental.
He saw a higher purpose for America, a sense of justice that wasn't just about who had more votes or more power.
And that really shaped his stance on slavery.
Absolutely. This moral conviction, this implacable vehemence, as Will calls it, came from his belief in principles that were bigger than just public opinion.
Okay, so then let's talk about natural rights. Will seems to present them not as some abstract God-given thing, but something more grounded.
Yeah, he's really going for a practical perspective here.
So what's the main point he's making?
He's arguing that natural rights are these essential claims that individuals need to make to live dignified and worthy lives.
Makes sense.
And this need for these rights comes from what it means to be human, our shared human nature.
So it's not coming from some higher authority.
Not necessarily. He suggests this belief in natural rights can come from just thinking carefully about what it means to be human.
And looking at the lessons we've learned throughout history.
Exactly. History gives us a lot of examples of what happens when these rights aren't respected.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Now, what about colonial society? Will talks about it being mostly vertical connections, not horizontal ones. What's that all about?
He's drawing on Wood's analysis here, which emphasized how hierarchical colonial society was.
So people felt connected to those above and below them, but not really across different social levels.
Yeah, there wasn't a strong sense of equality across those different strata.
And there was a lot of unfreedom too, right? Like slaves and indentured servants.
Definitely. Even Washington called the lower classes the grazing multitude.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that doesn't sound very egalitarian.
It really highlights the stark divisions that existed. Will points out that almost half of colonial society was unfree in some way,
That created a lot of dependency.
and even the governments were dominated by a small elite. So with this very hierarchical setup, the act of consent in a republic takes on a whole new meaning.
Why is that?
Because consent isn't just passive agreement, it implies the right to be persuaded.
And that requires citizens who can reason and think critically.
Right. Citizens who are worthy of respect. And in a republic, a government that has to persuade its people is secondary to those individuals it governs.
The people are the ultimate source of authority.
Exactly. Now let's talk about Madison. He had a pretty unsentimental view of human nature, right?
Oh, yeah. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition.
That's the one. What's so brilliant about that statement?
Well, Madison realized that people are driven by self-interest, and he designed a system that used that self-interest to its advantage, the separation of powers. It's all about checks and balances.
It's a very pragmatic way of dealing with power, you know?
But the founders weren't all doom and gloom. They believed in civic virtue, too.
Oh yeah, they definitely weren't cynics. They knew that good character was essential for a free society.
They thought virtues like hard work, self-control, moderation, personal responsibility, these were all key.
Right, and they believed that education and strong communities were essential for fostering those virtues.
Okay, so now let's switch gears a bit and talk about the progressive movement. How does that contrast with what the founders envisioned?
One big difference is the rise of pragmatism and its focus on achieving results, even if it's hard to define what improvement really means.
So it's more about what works rather than sticking to fixed principles.
In a way, yeah.
Mhm.
And this shift in emphasis meant that traditional ideas about individual rights started to be questioned.
Because if it's all about what's evolving and developing, then maybe those rights need to evolve too.
Right, and that's where thinkers like John Dewey come in. In the early 20th century, he really challenged the concept of inherent individual rights.
Yeah, he said that the individual is society concentrated and that government should be as comprehensive as society. What do you mean by that?
Well, he saw individuals as being fundamentally shaped by society.
So not separate and independent.
Right, and this led to the idea that the state had a bigger role to play in shaping individuals for the common good.
There's even that idea from Mary Follett that true liberty comes from obeying the group you helped create.
Exactly. So we're seeing this movement towards a more collectivist perspective.
Okay, and then Will talks about the plasticity of personhood. What's he getting at there?
Well, on one level, the idea that our environment shapes us is pretty basic. It's not really controversial.
People have been saying that for centuries.
Right. But Dewey's vision was much more radical.
He thought you could mold people into anything.
Almost, yeah. He believed in an almost limitless capacity to shape individuals through social engineering.
So a very different view from the founders who believed in a more fixed human nature.
And this idea of shaping better citizens is still around today.
Like with all the debate about controlling speech on college campuses.
Right. Will connects this back to Dewey's view of life as matter in motion.
So if there's no fixed human nature, then anything is possible.
In a way, yeah. And the Progressive Project becomes about removing any obstacles to creating these better consciousnesses.
Even if it means limiting individual freedoms.
But even with the best of intentions, government has its limits.
Right, totally. Even something like Social Security, a program that's largely considered successful, it can only do so much.
Yeah, Will makes the point that government's good at moving money around,
Redistributing wealth.
but it's a lot less effective at actually delivering services or changing people's behavior.
He even quotes President Taft, who was frustrated with an aide who thought of government like a simple machine.
Yeah, that's a great anecdote. It shows how complex governing really is.
Okay, so this brings us to another interesting point. Despite all the wealth that's been created, we're still seeing a lot of social problems.
Yeah, that's a real paradox. And Will argues that in America, poverty is often more about bad behavior than a lack of resources.
What does he mean by that?
He's pointing to data that shows a strong correlation between certain behaviors and poverty.
Like what kind of behavior?
Things like completing high school, delaying childbearing until marriage, and waiting until after age 20 to have kids.
So finishing your education, getting married before having children.
Exactly.
Yeah.
These things dramatically reduce the likelihood of being poor.
And he emphasizes the importance of a stable two-parent household.
Yeah, that comes up a lot in his analysis.
So what are conservatives worried about when it comes to the progressive approach to these issues?
The main concern is that all this focus on government assistance might actually weaken the very habits that help people thrive.
Habits like self-reliance, hard work, thrift.
Right. The worry is that people become dependent on the government and lose their motivation to improve their own lives.
It's not just about the financial cost of welfare.
It's about the potential moral cost,
Mm.
the erosion of personal responsibility.
Will even brings up Tocqueville's warning about soft despotism.
That gradual undermining of individual initiative and freedom.
And this connects to the conservative emphasis on social inertia.
That idea that we shouldn't be too quick to throw out the wisdom of the past.
Society shouldn't change too rapidly.
Right. Will contrasts the traditional view of education as passing on knowledge with the modern focus on liberation and questioning everything.
He seems to think that can lead to a kind of relativism where all values are equal.
And that makes it hard to make judgments about what's right and wrong.
Okay, now this next part is interesting. Will says that while the term un-American activities can be problematic, there are actually un-American principles.
Yeah, that's a bold statement. So how does he define American patriotism?
He says it's rooted in the belief in natural rights.
So not just a blind allegiance to the country.
Right. It's about those core principles that America was founded on. And he points out that while rights are considered inherent duties or not,
They have to be taught and cultivated.
and virtue is essential for balancing out self-interest in a free society.
Because if everyone's just looking out for themselves, it can lead to chaos.
And this all ties into the debates about what should be taught in universities.
Right. Will sees these as constitutional arguments about how the American mind is formed.
It's about shaping citizens who understand and uphold those founding principles.
Exactly. And in a democracy, public opinion matters a lot.
So it's crucial that those opinions are based on a solid understanding of those principles.
Will warns against forgetting those principles. He contrasts the founders' belief in reasoned moral and political hierarchies with the relativism that's common in academia today.
This idea that all perspectives are equally valid.
And that can be dangerous because it makes it hard to make judgments about what's good and bad.
Will also makes this interesting point about openness. He says that in trying to be open to everything, we might actually be closing ourselves off in some ways.
Yeah, that seems counterintuitive. How does he explain that?
He says that when openness becomes the ultimate value, it can lead to a kind of intellectual paralysis.
We become so afraid of making judgments that we can't even distinguish between good and bad ideas.
Right, and this brings us to what Will calls the errors of intellectualism. He contrasts the philosopher as interpreter with Marx's focus on changing the world.
And Marx's ideas had some pretty negative consequences.
Will's skeptical of these grand intellectual schemes that try to completely reshape society.
He sees them as ignoring the complexities of human nature.
He mentions Marx's ideas about inevitable social change and Freud's emphasis on irrational drives.
So the conservative approach is more cautious.
It's about working within the limitations of human nature rather than trying to perfect it.
And this leads to the conservative view of conflict as a natural part of the human experience.
We're inherently competitive and desirous, so there's always going to be some level of conflict.
Even with all our efforts to create peace.
Will uses the Kellogg-Briand Pact as an example.
That was a treaty that tried to outlaw war.
But it didn't really work, did it?
No, it didn't. Human nature is more powerful than any treaty.
And Will challenges this idea that great leaders are mainly motivated by economic factors.
The idea of homo economicus.
He points to Eckstein's work on Nazism, which argues that it was driven more by style, mood, and action than by economics.
So people aren't always rational actors. They're often driven by emotions and deeper psychological needs.
And to illustrate this point, Will gives a brief overview of the history of warfare,
showing how it's constantly evolving and adapting.
It's a reminder that conflict is a constant, but it takes different forms throughout history.
Now let's talk about the presidency. Will argues that the founders would be horrified by the modern rhetorical presidency.
Always trying to rally the public and stir up emotions.
They saw that as dangerous.
They wanted a president who communicated mainly with Congress through formal written messages.
Yeah, they were worried about direct appeals to the public because it could bypass thoughtful deliberation.
And this ties into the progressive tendency to prioritize majority rule over individual liberty.
The idea that whatever the majority wants goes.
But that can be dangerous for minority rights,
Exactly. And Will contrasts this with the idea of judicial engagement.
where the courts actively defend individual liberty, even against the will of the majority.
So it's about striking a balance between majority rule and protecting individual rights.
Okay, so now let's bring things down to earth a bit and talk about the amazing progress we've made in terms of living standards.
Oh yeah, we're incredibly wealthy compared to people in the past.
Will makes this comparison to being richer than Rockefeller in 1916, but still not having all the conveniences we have today.
It's a great way to visualize how much progress we've made.
Even the wealthiest people back then didn't have smartphones or air conditioning.
Or antibiotics, or the internet.
It's mind-blowing.
It really is. And then he talks about the income tax and how it's changed over time.
It started out focused on the wealthy, but now it's much broader,
And Will points out that a lot of people don't pay any federal income tax at all,
which can create a kind of moral hazard.
where people feel less accountable for how the government spends money.
And this connects to the progressive belief in using government to fine-tune equity.
Always trying to make things more fair,
But that can lead to a very complex and ever-changing tax code.
which can be confusing and make it hard for people to plan.
It creates uncertainty.
Exactly. And finally, Will argues that out of the three main economic issues, poverty, insecurity, and inequality is the least important.
Really? Even though we hear so much about it these days.
Yeah, he thinks it's a distraction from more fundamental issues.
Like making sure everyone has enough to live a dignified life.
Exactly. He brings up Frankfurt's doctrine of sufficiency.
The idea that what matters is whether people have enough, not whether everyone has the same amount.
And he ends by talking about the nation as an instrument of emancipation,
That idea that popular sovereignty is tied to national identity.
and that the nation-state can help liberate people from external control.
It's a reminder of how radical the American experiment really was.
So we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have. It's been a fascinating look at George Will's The Conservative Sensibility.
And if anyone's interested in exploring these ideas further through like AI-powered analysis,
Oh, yeah, there's this YouTube channel called Mindful Moments.
they do audiobook analyses of books like this.
Yeah, it's another way to dive deeper into these complex arguments.
We'll put a link in the description.
I think it's time to wrap things up. So to leave you with a final thought, I want to quote T.S. Eliot. "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time."
That's a good one.
It makes me think about how, by revisiting those foundational principles of America, we might rediscover that sense of possibility that the founders felt.
That's a powerful idea.
So if you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to the channel and share it with your friends.
And if you want to read George Will's book for yourself,
You can find a link in the description.
keep thinking critically about these ideas and what they mean for our society today.
Thanks for joining us.